Well, we're waiting for Jimi Hendrix, and okay, here we are. This is Michael James. I'm here with my pal Tom Clark.
Good morning, Michael.
We're down here at the lovely studios at WLUW 88.7 Chicago Sound Alliance. We're at 26 East Pearson. We're up here on the 3rd floor. It's quite nice doing it from here. You know, we do it usually from the Heartland Cafe at the corner of Glenwood and Lunt, and we've had wonderful times doing it there. And we'll be back there next week with some new technology. We're going to give up AT&T, and we're going to go to some kind of internet connection.
It's called satellite, Michael.
Satellite?
Yeah.
Okay.
It'll bounce off there and come back down, and even more people can hear us.
It's going to be nice. It'll be anywhere in the world they'll be able to get us. And you can get us anywhere in the world if you go to WLUW.org and spread that word. If you're going to South Africa, if you're going to Germany, you're going around the corner, and you need to get us through the internet, you can do it at WLUW.org.
Well, you know, we're officially the wettest August in years, and that's really held up the fall harvest. We're going to be getting stuff a lot later this season, but red havens are in for Michigan. Visit the farmers markets around Glenwood Street, and you'll find just wonderful fruit beginning to come in. Actually, it has been coming in all summer, but we're just getting stuff a few weeks later. And I understand you got your first cucumber out of your backyard.
Well, yeah, you know, it's we've got quite an agricultural scene going over there at the house. We had some green beans going on, and then we got some various other herbs growing. And then Paige came in yesterday, and she had this big cucumber, and she said, "This is my first cucumber." And we sliced it up. I put a little seasoned vinegar on it. It was delish.
We have all sorts of both heirloom and normal cherry tomatoes, but the regular fruit, we're going to need more heat to get these green tomatoes to really turn ripe for us.
Well, you know, back in the day in the Heartland Cafe, we used to have fried green tomatoes.
And that's a wonderful dish too.
With cornmeal, and they were great. Sauce.
And with the summer weather and that, our 4 hens are producing regularly 3 or 4 eggs a day. So the urban gardening experiment and farm continues to be a successful effort.
What's the latest update on the number of people with chickens in the neighborhood?
We need to do new inventory as we come out of this summer season because it keeps growing. Although our benefactor, Tom Rosenfeld, apparently is taking a little break from the city side part of the egg production. His farm is still, of course, still producing all great stuff, and you ought to stop by the Heartland Cafe to see the new offerings in the general store.
It's quite impressive, all the stuff we
lots
got
of
in
local
there.
farmers from within 50, 60 miles of Chicago, the Fresh Coast, that Tom has brought into the general store now, including locally produced tofu and a bunch of other dairy products. It's a really nice setup. You got to come by and take a look at it.
It's good. That's the farm report live from the Heartland this morning. Okay, we have a really interesting lineup. We're going to focus on some serious issues, mainly around the police. We've got our old pal Dennis Cunningham, my first lawyer. At least I think you were my first lawyer, Dennis.
Okay.
Was left over from the Democratic Convention or some event nearby. No, it wasn't. It was. I'm not going into it. Okay, so Dennis is a longtime progressive lawyer. He is living in California these days. He was here with the People's Law Office for many years, did the Fred Hampton case, he did the Attica case, he did the Judy Bari environmental case out there in California. Recently he got some guards who had really tormented a prisoner, won that case. So good morning to you, Dennis Cunningham.
Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning.
I'm so glad to be here again.
What is the state of the state? Of the way the police help protect
the state of
us?
the police
The
state.
state of the police state. Well, it's a really good question, I think, these days. Certainly the events in Missouri have brought it to the fore. And, it's an old question. It's certainly a big, old, important question in the city of Chicago. And I think the reason to talk about it today or any particular time is because, not least because of what the events in Ferguson showed to the rest of the country, and particularly about the warlike police response that was made to the protest there. And I'm sure those shots, those images were shocking to a lot of people. To see that they would so quickly muster such a massive and such a warlike, you say it again, a military response. So that here you got a bunch of kids marching down the street protesting, maybe not just kids, I'm sure not just kids. And you look the other way, and there's like an invading army, like they just landed on the beach. And they're making their way inland, and they're going to wipe out everything that's in their way. And you get the feeling that if it had been up to them, they would have. And that's it looks to me like that's now what you can put your finger on as the kind of the essence of the police state in America, is the fact that they've all been militarized, all these departments all over the country that have been given all this so-called surplus military equipment. I mean, there needs to be a lot more study, and I'm sure there will be, or a lot more information come out, like how many police departments in the country got tanks, how many got half-tracks and Bradley fighting vehicles, that are prepared for war or for urban war. And I think that some of the study would show, if the information were forthcoming, that that's the way they think about what they're facing, what's coming in the future. They interviewed Snowden and asked him, why is the NSA really doing this? Why would they want all that surveillance of the entire population? It can't possibly be rationally related to the detection of terrorist messages, because it's too much needle in the haystack. But he says, no, it's for social control.
Yeah, we've always, that's kind of been out there in the dialogue on the progressive side of things, that the police were always preparing for, mass urban unrest.
Yes.
As the economy fails and people are demanding more. We used to hear stories that there was a whole police station down on the south side near the expressway, underground, where railroads went into. What do you know about that?
I remember that, and I think the one on the west side is the same thing. They got a tank port. They got a ramp into the basement that the tank can roll out of, and I'm sure they also have a huge rationale that they could sit here and run to you as to why they have to have it, and why they they can't take a chance on not being prepared to respond militarily to civil unrest in the country.
We don't know the particulars yet of the Michael Brown shooting. We have some ideas, but there has not been an official investigation. All the Attorney General and the federal government's looking into it. But clearly the reaction of the local police department is not something that just happened as a result of the slaying. And of course the rest of the world, because of the attention around the slaying, got to see up front and personally, I think is your point, what kind of militarization our domestic police forces really have.
Yes.
But there's another element that I think speaks to the state of the police state, which is the gap between whites and blacks over the everyday occurrence people of color have in their normal interactions with police, whether they're in a big city or a small town, versus the rest of us who, whether it's white privilege or whatever, we kind of can walk around without worrying about that.
Mm-hmm.
To my mind, that's the more critical thing that's been raised here, whatever the particulars turn out to be around the slaying of Michael Brown.
Well, I think that's right, and I think that it's also right with respect to the particulars about so-called militarization of the police. I mean, that's a really interesting and important subject, but it's a subset of the subject, of the police state subject, because it's a symptom and not a cause. And the cause is more the kind of stuff you're talking about that existed in Ferguson before Michael Brown was killed, and that we see now as the information comes out is not just about the police. It's about the white domination of a black population, and the way it's maintained, the way that civil court functions, it gives 3 warrants per family. In
Yeah,
the whole town.
that's just breaking news. Tell people about that. I mean, there's like, I think I've heard it was 6 warrants per family.
That might be right, I could have
I
it
mean,
wrong.
the police department, the city government seems to be making money off the exploitation and, of their local
The
constituency,
population, and that means the black population, because those are the ones that get stopped in the cars and get the tickets, and then, they lock the courtroom 5 minutes after 9, so you can't get in if you come late, and then you gotta come back, and that means your fine doubles, whatever. I mean, the story I read was complicated, and I didn't absorb it all of the way the system works, but it results in an average of 3 warrants per family in the whole town. So that means, either it means everybody's in trouble with the police, or it means some people are in trouble all the time and can never pay off that stuff. It's like one of those mortgage loans, or whatever different ways that the system hooks up poor people to have to give up all their money.
Dennis Cunningham, what's your sense about how this plays out on the national level, like white, black, conservative, progressive? There's some talk, like on the Rachel Maddow show, I believe I saw, where some police officers actually tear gassed people who were on their own property, just gathered together. So, and I'm wondering if the conservative movement is just going to be the rah-rah for the officer who we don't know if he'll be indicted or not. How do you see it shaping up on that level? Was there any step forward on this? Because a lot of Republican congressmen, senators even, seem to be concerned about the situation in Ferguson. Now, I'm not sure where they're at now. You even have Rand Paul, is that the one, the son? Rand Paul.
But he's a particular case because the libertarians really do have a principled objection to, that kind of lines them up with the good people, and because they have that same outlook towards authority, even maybe carried to an extreme. But I don't, I mean the black-white question, as you called it, in particular places, all the big cities, all the places where the normal level of conflict between police and communities of color is so high, and where you could go to the courthouse and everybody in there is black except for the cops and the personnel, the judges, and even then, it's very hard to I think to see ahead where it's going to go, because you saw in Ferguson a population that jumped up so quick.
It was impressive.
And that was something. I mean, that word spread, and even in a circumstance where apparently the facts of what happened are a little ambiguous, and probably, I mean, they say they're running this investigation, they're running that investigation. They're not going to come up with information that hasn't already been referred to. Now, what happens when everybody is under oath and cross-examined is something else again.
Let me ask this question a slightly different way. Since 9/11, there's been a certain amount of governance by fear. People were understandably reacting out of fear of what happened. And we got into a war or two as a result of that, being fearful. So let's accept for a moment that one reason for a police state is that people are afraid and they want stuff under control. How do we offset the fear so that people might actually pay more attention to things like constitutional rights? There's a time and place for this, but not for that.
Boy, is that a good question. I mean, when you think of how passive the population is generally, and how, shopping aside, they don't do much except go to ball games and stuff. I mean, they don't. It's unpredictable, it seems to me, because they've gone for so much, and because you can't assign that much skill at propaganda the Bush Cheney machine, that they were able to hoodwink an entire population just behind the horrific attacks, although that obviously gave the big impulse to it. But then the function of the media as the propaganda machine for the system kind of takes over, right? It just acts reflexively. And so then everything is about terrorism. And terrorism is scary. And you could say, well, how long are we going to wait before the first car bomb in America, you know, or the first thing? And then how much more will the fear factor jump up into the process of cowing the population? And then how much more isolated will the communities of color be that do, you know, harbor the impulse to resist the police oppression? You know, it's a general tone of it. I mean, I think this, like you said, we don't know quite yet how the facts will shake out about the encounter between Michael Brown and this cop. But I think nobody has disagreed that what first happened was they're walking down the road and the cop drives by and words are exchanged, and then the cop screeches to a halt and backs up, right? Well, that's because he's ready for trouble. He wants to do some stuff here. He's going to have him, and here's a big guy. There's something about cops, many cops, they always want to go after the big guys, you know. They always want to show how bad they are, and the big guy is always a target. But, you know, why didn't he just keep going? It's because he's got something in him, in his personality, in his heart, in his outlook, and it was never trained out of him. He was never screened to see if he had it or if he had too much of it. He was never tested. He was never checked. He was never monitored or followed in such a way as to make sure he wasn't abusing people. And neither is any other cop, from one end of this country to the other.
I think they probably feel, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they can get away with this.
Yes.
And it's been a long time since we had a really viable civil rights struggle in our streets, you know, back from the 60s into the 70s with the Panthers, etc. And, this term came to mind just now. It's called the material becomes manifest through the accidental. And it's a Marxist term from a guy named Cornforth back in my study group days. But that which is intended to happen, or it will happen because of the social, political, economic forces, will be kicked off by the accidental event. Mm-hmm. And in this case, you had Ferguson, you know, down there in Missouri.
Like a powder keg.
It just went off, you know, and it's like we had Trayvon Martin, we've had plenty of other things, you know, Al Sharpton was very good at that funeral, and a lot of people talking about, you know, we've just had enough. And there's a whole list of people, you know, who have been abused by the police with not much happening. Now, the question I'm coming to now with you is, what do you think, is going to happen now? Is the black community going to be energized? Is there more sympathy from white communities? Or we're going to go back to the way it was? Slowly go back to that position. Is this one of those moments that tipped off, a whole bunch of anger and frustration and maybe some well-guided plans for making some significant change? Registering to vote will affect the election. Any of you guys got any view on that stuff?
Well, it's impossible to know, isn't it? I mean, you could say, well, it's not impossible to hope for, and to wish that people would stay woke. You know, I mean, as we were talking before, you know, is Ferguson getting pushed out of the news by anodyne stuff, or by, you know, insubstantial or substantial stuff? But will the waters close again over it? You know? Now you mentioned Trayvon, and then there was a kid that got killed in Florida for the rap music in the car by the guy who was then, they couldn't convict him of murder, even though he just went and murdered the guy.
Yeah, why did he not get convicted? What was the deal on that? He was a cop too, I think.
No, or
No.
maybe he was.
I think he was.
Or he had some kind of law
Yeah.
enforcement connection. But he went off too, like this cop did in Missouri. And that happens, you know, you can't quantify it, but you know it happens in lots of the cases. They have the same feeling of empowerment, permission, impunity about abusing people in the street that they do about lying in their reports about what happened when they, you know.
People really have to
Something
understand
goes
that the
wrong.
police do lie.
Here,
A lot of
here's
times.
my effort to be hopeful about this. I never thought I would see in my lifetime the progress that the LGBT community has made, not just around marriage equality, but in general.
Yes.
And talk about, you know, in college, that was another heavily discriminated against group, not even talked about. And look how far that's come. I wonder what kind of a catalyst will be needed beyond something like Ferguson.
Yeah, the one variable I'm going to throw in on that, though, you know, as a father of 2 gay kids, you know, I've seen this, the rights of LGBT people really advance quickly. But I think everybody in the country has somebody they know or someone in their
That's
family
right.
who
That's
is
right.
of that, you know, is LGBT.
That's right.
And
so they
it's not
identify.
true, everyone doesn't have
Have
a black friend
person in
or a
their
black
family.
relative.
So maybe
Yeah,
that's
it's
the
really
key.
a difference.
Yes, there
Given
is.
that we're becoming a majority-minority country.
That's the
within
hope. As we understand that the police can play a meaningful and important role in society, we also know that certainly in our town, here in Chicago, there has been a long history of corrupt police officers, corrupt administration around the police, and that kind of thing. And I guess I'm just hoping that sometime there'll be a rising tide of concern and anger and a better government, so to speak, where that changes.
Well, you know, there are a couple of things to say to that. One is, in doing this work over the years, I've come to have tremendous respect for good police officers.
Yeah, me too.
You know, and a friend of mine who ran a national victim organization once said, you know, in democracy, there's nothing like a good cop and there's nothing like a bad cop. You know, I mean, this is a critical role in our civil society, and all the more so in those neighborhoods that have a lack of sort of infrastructure. You know,
Yeah, and resources, whether it be schools, job access, training, etc.
So the policeman on the street is in many neighborhoods in urban America, and probably in rural America, although I just don't have experience in that setting, the most important public official that in people's lives
Yeah,
they
that's true.
encounter.
You're listening to Jamie Kalven, who's with the Invisible Institute, which also runs the experimental station in Hyde Park. He's an independent journalist who was responsible for getting the city to release files on the list of police who have been accused of abusing their police powers. I'm Tom Clark. You're listening live from the Heartland. My colleague Michael James is with us today. And Jamie, I think one of the things I found curious since the release of the list is that this past week, a high-level commander, Commander Evans, was indicted. He was a name on that list. Although I understand there was already a case beginning to move along against him. What do you think the release of your list had to do with moving up or influencing this indictment?
One can't know for sure, but I think from just the sequence of events, there's every reason to believe that the release of the list, the attention of journalists, particularly at WBZ, to kind of connecting the dots. This case that had been pending and had been referred to the state's attorney's office for review by IVRA, and then finding that Evans was high on the list and had an unusually high number of excessive force complaints, I think nudged and pushed the state's attorney to act. I mean, we're inferring that. But I want to go back to something Michael said, which is I think we do have an opportunity right now. Because really what was this decision, Kalven versus Chicago, that led to the release of the list, and now is law, for journalists, for civil rights attorneys, for concerned citizens. We have access to information about police misconduct that the city has fiercely fought until now to withhold. And my hope is that the Commander Evans, the Glenn Evans case, is the first of many instances where people pursuing information that's now available to us and being strategic about it roots out abusive officers who've been allowed to continue way beyond when the authorities should have intervened.
What in light of Ferguson, do you find it ironic or perhaps troubling that the first person indicted since you released the list is an African American?
You know, in terms of my experience,
Burge is still getting his pension.
yeah. Well, you know, I mean, these are complicated, different, particular
Right.
situations, and
But it's a good question.
it's a good question. It's a good question, but it's, you know, the Ferguson. In light of, and I don't know Ferguson as a, you know, as a setting.
Right.
In light of our experience in Chicago, having more blacks on the police force would not dramatically improve the conditions for residents of Ferguson if there weren't a whole range of other changes. You know, some of the ugliest and most racialized behavior that we've seen and documented over the years has been by African Americans.
Yeah, remember Glove Davis and the assassination of Fred Hampton.
Yeah, and it wasn't, I'm not saying it's unique, I mean, you know, it just means that you have, this is an institution. I mean, I think what Ferguson has brought home to people, and I do think this is the front line of the civil rights movement in our time, is, you know, if racial disparities, racial exclusion, structures of, you know, racist structures remain the central and defining issue in American life, then these issues of police accountability aren't just another issue. This is the way in which those structures are enforced, or a major way in which they are enforced, a major way in which whole populations are criminalized, are effectively disenfranchised. And so I think the contribution of Ferguson has been to bring questions of police accountability into that core space of fundamental civil rights work that lies behind us and lies ahead of us. And the opportunity we have in Chicago, but we have to seize it. I mean, we really have to seize it, is to use these new tools that we have, use information, connect the dots, maintain the leverage on the city. You know, and what has tended to happen, certainly in the 20-odd years that I've been involved in this, somebody like Dennis could, you know, go back to Fred Hampton, is we've had recurring patterns of scandal reform, scandal reform, scandal reform, but the reforms aren't real reforms. They tend to be reform gestures. Somebody gets fired, a corrupt or abusive unit gets disbanded but then reconstituted under another name. There's a Blue Ribbon Commission that issues a report, and as soon as public attention, and particularly the press, moves on, or we give a new superintendent a honeymoon to see, or a new agency, then things revert back to the status quo. So I would go so far as to say that in all the litigation, you know, going back to the 70s and 80s with the Burge case, nothing has changed in terms of the underlying conditions that allow abusive officers to run their game with impunity. You can't, I mean, there have been minor changes, so post-Burge, you can't do it in the interrogation room. That space is closed down. With the demolition of public housing, a space where people could just do whatever they wanted has shut down. But there are other spaces. Michael was referring to them before. There are all sorts of street corners and alleys and abandoned neighborhoods nobody cares about, and Ferguson's, where there is the same level of freedom and impunity for abusive officers.
If you had a crystal ball and you were looking at the internal dynamics of the police, the leadership of the police, the administration, its relationship to the mayor, how would you picture that? And you know, I also, just for the listeners to realize, the other side of this is the conditions in the community have not improved. We have closing of schools, we have a job situation, we have healthcare issues. You know, so you got a community that may have more crime than ever because of conditions. You also have a police force that gets slicker and slicker at how to keep that situation in place rather than have urban rebellion. Your thoughts on any of that?
So, I'm going to come at it a different way because I've just come out of, in the course of the aftermath of this decision, out of extensive negotiations at a high level with the administration, with the Corporation Counsel, the chief lawyer, and
You were talking to those guys.
we were talking to those, and with Flint Taylor and John Lowy and Craig Clutterman, my lawyers in this, and because there was a whole settlement process after the decision came down. And I actually came away with a measure of sympathy for the administration.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what I mean. I think if they could, on the basis of all this interaction with them, I think if they could say, from this day forward, we will have transparency. From this day forward, we will do rigorous investigations. From this day forward, we will protect whistleblowers within the department, and we will, counter the code of silence. I think they would do it. It's cost effective, it's good government, it's all those things. But you can't do it because even with the Kalven decision now, that isn't from this day forward. That opens the door on all sorts of inherited stuff from the past. This has been unaddressed for so long that there are patterns of police criminality going back decades. Look at, the Glenn Evans thing was just one small example. So, the other really telling statistic is that in the last decade, since 2004, the city has paid out $500 million in settlements and awards.
And to keep a few schools
In
open.
police abuse cases. Well, they're concerned about it. They're hemorrhaging money. There's more in the coming. There are cases that we have reason to believe haven't erupted as scandals yet. They're sort of undetonated, but they know they're there. That they're dealing with. So we have something that is so dysfunctional at every level. Nobody would have invented the police department we have now, that has evolved and kind of metastasized through the deferral of all these fundamental human rights issues. So I think the challenging thing, and I say this with a measure of sympathy, is to ask ourselves what level and quality of leadership would actually be required to address this. We're talking about Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela sort of leadership. Somebody saying this is so fundamental that we have to risk everything to address this.
My kind of insider knowledge about this culture that's so hard to change is as we tried to launch community policing 20 years ago,
Yeah.
which we never really got in Chicago
Never.
because
Now they watered it down.
it was really watered down, and in fact the officers who get assigned to that are treated like social workers who don't
Right.
get points for making
Right.
arrests and stuff because the nature of their work is different, and so they try to get out of it as quickly as they can, understandably, because they can't advance.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that's part of the culture of this sort of police state about, what's important for that officer to do, which is not connecting with the community, but keeping the community controlled.
Right, and I think the great, the really, it's taken years for me to see this. I think having rigorous investigations and protocols and processes and procedures is really important. But culture trumps process. Culture trumps process, and that's the real challenge for leadership. There has to be another level of leadership.
On the culture front, in terms of the culture within the police department, back in the heyday of, a few years back, we had Renault Robinson and the African American Patrolmen's Association. And they really were a voice for some change, and he ended up giving out parking tickets,
Right.
But I'm just wondering, you being around all of this, are there any movements within the police department, any groups? The union always seems a little bit sluggish and not very progressive, but I'm wondering if with more women on the force, more non-whites, more blacks, more Latinos, is there any kind of bubbling up among the police officers themselves to make changes?
It's interesting. The union is really retrograde.
Yeah.
I've dealt with the union recently since the decision came down and since I released the documents, and they're charged with. Their mission is to represent every police officer who's charged. They've tried to weaken this. I'm assuming, and I've always assumed, that there is a very, very significant faction or multiple factions within the police department who support the work that we do, who deplore these patterns, who are incredibly frustrated to be lumped together with criminals with badges, who know that their own effectiveness as officers is greatly undermined by the criminals on the force. But the thing that is not a myth is ferocious, and really a huge factor is the code of silence within the department. So the retaliation, you mentioned Ronald Robinson walking and giving out parking tickets, that's mild compared to what some of those who try to break ranks suffer. I mean, you're talking about friendly fire, you're talking about an intensely fraternal organization in which people are utterly ostracized and shunned by their colleagues, making work almost intolerable from day to day.
I actually got an email this morning from a friend I know through running community who was on the Red Squad. He's retired, and he actually said, you guys were right, and now we're together. And
Yeah.
He said, I apologize for having chased you all around the city back in the day. But there are certainly, I've met a number of retired policemen who are very open about stuff, and hopefully the younger guys and girls will start to speak up.
It would make a big difference if it happened.
Jamie Kalven, people want to find out more about your work or the next set of lists you're going to be releasing. How can they get in touch with you?
Probably the best way is to go to the Invisible Institute site, invisibleinstitute.com. We have a lot more in the pipeline.
Good luck in your investigative journalism.
Tom, tell us who we got coming up in the next few weeks.
Well, we're going to be marking Labor Day weekend a week late with your colleague who's coming here next
Bob
week,
Lawson.
Bob Lawson.
Former
And-
community organizer, went off to work for SEIU, United Auto Workers, and he's one sharp dude who's going to talk about the labor movement.
And on September 13th, we expect to be back at the Heartland, if not next week, and we'll be featuring mayoral candidate Amara Enya and Angela Caputo, an investigative reporter for the Chicago Reporter, who will be talking about her latest story about how money is spent in the parks, or where it is and isn't spent, depending on what neighborhood you're living in. And then on September 20th, we will return to this issue of crime in public safety. We're going to talk with longtime neighbor and former beat rep chair Kevin O'Neill about what's really been happening in Rogers Park the last summer and the last 2 or 3 years, maybe at Solutions.
I want to thank everybody who's helped make this show possible. Grant Steskel, Hal James, Paul and Mary Wozniak, Dan Kugler,
And Steve Franklin, a colleague of mine, formerly of the Chicago Tribune, who's been working a lot the last 3 years on trying to shift coverage of crime to looking at anti-violence.